Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director at Word on Fire. And joining us here, as he does almost every single week, is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, it is always delightful to talk with you.
Hey, Brandon. How you doing? How's little Gilbert doing?
Little Gilbert's doing well. Gilbert's our sixth child for listeners. He was just born a few weeks ago, and he's
named for Gilbert Keith Chesterton and C.S. Lewis.
That's right. That's right. And as you've noted, he looks an awful lot like Gilbert Chesterton at this point, with all the rolls around his neck and arms and all over the place.
He does.
Hey, listen, before we get into this episode, which is the second part of our conversation about Jordan Peterson, this popular intellectual figure, I want to give people an update on your schedule. You got a really busy couple weeks here coming up. Tell us about some of the things you're doing.
Yeah, March is going to be a really busy month. I'll be at the University of Notre Dame in the beginning of March for this talk on the on young people and reaching the nuns, and kind of in preparation for the synod next October. And then I'm going to go to the USCCB meeting. So now I'm chair of the Bishop's Committee on Evangelization and Catechesis. So I'm going to preside at that meeting. But I'm also on the Religious Liberty Committee, and as a committee chair, I'm on what they call the Administrative Committee as well. So I've got all kinds of work there. I come right back from that, go directly to the LA Religious Ed Congress in Anaheim, where I'm giving a talk. And then I think it's the very next day, Brandon, you're going with me, right? We're going to go up to San Francisco. And I've got three things up there. One is a talk at Google headquarters. I'm looking forward to a lot. And then a talk at St. Mary's College in Moraga on Catholic intellectual tradition. And then finally, I'm giving the Chrism Day for the priests of San Francisco. So anyway, I'll be gone from my house here, I think, about 3 weeks in the month of March. So pray that I got the energy for all that.
Well, I mentioned this is the second part of our conversation about Jordan Peterson. If you missed the first part, go listen to the last episode titled "Who is Jordan Peterson?" But a very brief recap before we go into the discussion further. Jordan Peterson is a Canadian clinical psychologist, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and an enormously influential figure. Over the last 6 months, he sort of exploded onto the scene through his YouTube videos, through his interviews, also through his new book. He just came out with a book titled 12 Rules for Life, which still a month later sits at #1 on Amazon among all books. It's the best-selling book in America, England, Canada, Australia, virtually everywhere. So we've been discussing who Jordan Peterson is, why he's sort of exploded in popularity. And in this episode, we're going to focus specifically on his religious teachings. He spends a lot of his time engaging the Bible and the great philosophical and mythical traditions. So we wanted to get Bishop Barron's thoughts from the perspective of a Catholic bishop. What does he think about all this? So let's start there, Bishop. Let me ask this general question. What do you most like about Jordan Peterson's work?
Oh, I like a lot. And our last episode, we explored quite a bit of that. In terms of this religious business, I like how he is opening up the biblical text in a very fresh way, I think, for most readers today, and in a way that is very psychologically and practically useful to them. And I think that's a really important contribution he's making. And to be honest with you, it's a bit of a judgment, I think, on the churches that we've not been as good at opening up the depth of our own scriptures as well as he has. In a way, clearly it's appealing to younger people. So I like that a lot in his, I found a lot of his readings very interesting and provocative.
I remember the shock that you expressed when we shared with you one of the early biblical lectures he did. These are 2 hours, 3 hours long, and they're very dense, very slow and methodical, that he analyzes 1 or 2 chapters from the book of Genesis, for example. But these videos get 1 million views, 2 million views. People are tuning in.
Yeah, and I said last week, I think that the first thing I saw of his was a lecture on Nietzsche's, Beyond Good and Evil. It was a pretty serious lecture. See, and I take great comfort from that, because my fear, and Brandon, I've talked about this, is with the millennials and younger people too, that, they're so geared to screens and the sort of, quick cut editing culture, and, don't give me a serious book to read, just give me a couple pictures to look at. That are young people able to handle a more sustained analysis? And I think the Peterson phenomenon proves, they are interested in that. So I take comfort from that.
Let's take the flip side of that question. What most troubles you or bothers you about Peterson's approach?
Well, and maybe in the course of our conversation, we can get to it in more detail. Basically, and again, I'm not blaming him because he's not claiming to be a Christian theologian. He's not saying, here's the right way to read Christianity. He's offering a psychological reading of the biblical text. The danger, I'll put it that way, the danger in that kind of approach, and it's true in C.G. Jung and many others, is a Gnosticizing danger, by which I mean the tendency to move in a Gnostic direction, that Christianity comes down to a hidden truth that a few cognoscenti, those who are kind of clued into the symbol system, discern, that we bracket the historicity of the Bible, that history is much less important than the hidden knowledge. Now, in the original form of Gnosticism, it was more of a philosophical sort of wisdom that the cognoscenti, right, the knowers, understood. St. Irenaeus and many others of the church fathers fought in favor of an historically grounded Christianity. So that's always the danger when we propose a purely philosophical, mythic, or psychological reading of the Bible, that we bracket historicity. But maybe as we talk more about it, we can specify that.
Yeah, let's dig immediately into that very question about Jordan Peterson's psychological reading of the Bible. I mentioned he's done a lot of these YouTube lectures where he picks apart parts of the Old Testament. Right now is what he's focusing on, one chapter at a time, looking at it through the lens of a clinical psychologist. Two questions about this. One, is this psychological approach to the Bible novel? Is it kind of something new and fresh that he's sort of brought to bear, or does it have a long lineage? And then second, is this a helpful approach? Is it helpful to look at these stories psychologically? What do you think?
Well, first of all, yes, indeed, it does have a long lineage. In fact, Peterson's great intellectual hero is Carl Jung, the psychologist. And Jung is the one who said the first great psychologists were the church fathers. And that's a very provocative remark, because I'll go back to the sermons of Chrysostom and Jerome and the great works of Augustine, especially, and Origen, Irenaeus. What you find is a very perceptive psychological reading of the biblical text. So yes, it's an old tradition. Second observation is this: the Catholic intellectual tradition, at its best, is capacious and inclusive. Here's what I mean. We believe that the Logos, right, the mind of God, inspired the great works of the Bible in this sort of definitive and privileged way. So we say that the Bible is the word of the Lord in a sort of premier sense. But if that's true, that the Logos, capital L, inspired the Bible, well then whenever you find Logos, small l, if you want, philosophy and psychology and biology, whenever you find reason articulated, mathematics, science, philosophy, mythology, you're going to find at least an echo of what's in the Bible. You'll find something congruent with the Bible. You know, one of the unsung heroes here is St. Justin the Martyr, very, very early figure, arguably the first theologian. And Justin the Martyr makes this argument, and it becomes a commonplace among the church fathers. It makes Thomas Aquinas possible, right? Where Thomas says, look, I can use the great philosophy of Aristotle, someone who's outside of biblical revelation completely, but yet articulates the Logos philosophically. That's the spirit, I think, that the Catholic tradition at its best has had, which means, sure, if a psychologist, right, another Logos purveyor, right, if a psychologist is seeing deep and true things, yeah, there'll be a lot of congruence with what's in the Bible. Here's a third observation. Think of the great Vatican II statement that the Bible is the word of God in the words of men, right? So it's not as though God is simply dictating the scripture and that people are taking it down like automatons. No, God inspires the human authors, and in their words. Now, to say their words means to say their minds. To say their minds is to say their psyches. To say their psyches is to say even at the depth level of their psyches, where you might find things like archetypal influence, etc. So are we surprised that this psychological dimension that Peterson is unearthing is in the Bible? No, not at all. I'm not surprised by it, and I welcome it because it's in congruence with the deepest purposes of the Logos, capital L. So that's kind of a way of contextualizing this thing.
One of Peterson's strengths, I think it's part of what attracts a lot of people to him, is that he's not an ideologue. He's not locked in any one box. And that makes him very tough to pigeonhole. You know, whenever I've been talking with a lot of my friends about him, one of the first questions they ask is he a Christian? And I say, I don't know how to answer that. And I think that's probably what he would say too. What do you make of Peterson's religious views? I remember you and I talking about this one particular passage in his new book, 12 Rules for Life, where he says, this is what Christianity is all about. And I remember that kind of rubbed you the wrong way. Talk about his religious views, or at least what we can detect from his work.
Yeah, let's maybe bracket that where I'm balking there. And I'm balking because it tends in the Gnostic direction. But see, I would say this, I don't think he's claiming to be a Christian theologian, not even a Christian. And that's his business. I don't really know what his deepest convictions are. But I think what's helpful is he's uncovering a dimension of these texts that is very life-giving and illuminating. Mind you now, these texts, which by a lot of the intellectual establishment in the West have been dismissed as Bronze Age mythology, as oppressive patriarchal, falderall. So I think what he's done is he's within the academy has recovered why these texts have been preserved for so long and why they've spoken so deeply to some of the greatest spirits in the world, right? And I think that's a huge service that he's doing. So it's not Christian theology. I'm not expecting that of him. But I think he's doing a great service within the academy to recover for younger people, like why these texts have been so revered. And see, it breaks my heart. I'm banging on my computer. It breaks my heart when a young person will say, oh yeah, I'm not going to read, the book of Genesis because it's all patriarchal. Ay. Even if it were patriarchal, even if it were, what a tragedy that you take these foundational texts of our Western culture and just dismiss them out of hand. So I say 3 cheers for Jordan Peterson for recovering the power of these texts within the academy. Now, we can talk further about, the full meaning of these texts and a fully theological appropriation. Fine. But I don't think he's in some ways doesn't have a dog in that fight. See, if he were a liberal theologian, he were claiming to be giving a full-throated account of Christianity, I would have a much bigger objection. But I don't think he's even in that ballpark.
We've said in this episode, in the past one, that he focuses almost exclusively on this psychological, archetypal reading of the Bible. And he seems somewhat allergic to or ambivalent of both history and metaphysics. When we've talked about this, you've referenced something called Lessing's Gulf. I hadn't heard of that before. Tell us about that and why it's important and relevant here.
Lessing is not in himself that significant a figure, but he gave an image to the tradition which has proven to be extremely powerful. Lessing is a 18th century German figure, and he's writing at the time when a lot of doubt was creeping in about our ability to recover the historical ground for the Bible. A lot of skepticism about these stories of the Bible and, can we ever know these historical truths? So Lessing proposes that we should really stay on one side of that gulf. We're never going to get back to those truths, but rather stay on the side that says, the Bible contains great timeless truths, whether of the philosophical type or of the mystical type or the psychological type. And, let's bracket the question of history. We'll never get there anyway, Well, that little distinction proved to be enormously influential in the 19th and well into the 20th century. As I would say, most of the major figures are balking at, weeping over, trying to leap over, cursing Lessing's Gulf. Like, how do we solve this problem? Because Christianity is a stubbornly historical religion. So it's, yes, easier indeed to stay on one side of Lessing's Gulf and say, well, who cares about history? Whether it happened or not, who cares? There are these deep, timeless truths in the Bible. Well, okay, there are deep, timeless truths in the Bible, but it does matter immensely in regard to certain things that they really happen. See, so that's a major theme in theology of the last couple hundred years. Now, in a way, and again, I'm not blaming him because he's not claiming to be a theologian, but Peterson is staying on one side of Lessing's gulf. He's saying, history, let's bracket that. But there are these timeless archetypal truths going on in these stories. And I'd say, which indeed there are. But I think as a Christian theologian, we got to manage Lessing's gulf. See, we have to deal with that in a way maybe that Jordan Peterson, as a pure psychologist, doesn't.
Well, Jordan was recently asked to cross Lessing's gulf in an interview he did with Patrick Coffin, who's a popular Catholic radio host and cultural commentator. And he was asked pretty directly, Dr. Peterson was, what he thought of the resurrection. I'm going to play the clip from the interview that they had. It's about a minute long, and then I want to get your thoughts on it, Bishop. So here's Patrick Coffin asking Dr. Jordan Peterson what he thinks about the resurrection of Jesus.
Where are you in this discernment process on the historical nature of Christ, and especially the resurrection?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I do believe that there are places where the mythological and the literal touch. Mm-hmm. I mentioned one of those earlier, the idea that spoken truth, logos, creates habitable order out of chaos. I think that is literally and metaphorically true. I don't think you can state the nature of being and the role that consciousness plays in it more accurately than that. And so it's metaphysically true, it's religiously true, and it's literally true all at the same time. And so there are times when that happens, and I don't know. See, this is the mystery to me, I would say. I understand what that means. I understand that there are times when the literal and the metaphysical or religious co-occur. And I can understand
so that the literal is the foundation upon which the symbolic or the psychological...
Yeah, it's like the way I've been conceptualizing it is it's as if the material reaches up towards the spiritual and the spiritual reaches down towards the material, and now and then they touch. And that's a miracle when that happens. Mm-hmm. It's a miracle when that happens. And I do think that happens. With regards to the resurrection, apart from saying what I just said, I would say that I need to think about that for about 3 more years before I would even venture an answer beyond what I've already given. Because there's very much there that I don't understand as well as I need to understand.
What do you make of his answer there?
There's a lot I like in that answer. And I remember this from my reading of Jung years ago, what he suggests there about the archetypal and the historical touching from time to time. Well, what's the language we use from John's Gospel? With the Word became flesh, the Logos, right? The mind of God, at one point in history, becomes flesh. The Logos and history touch. And I like the way he put it there. It's kind of a Jungian thing that occasionally the archetypal and the historical meet. The tendency of the material upward toward the spiritual, the tendency of the spiritual downward to matter occasionally meet. And when that happens, it's a miracle. Not bad. That's not a bad way to talk about it. So I think that's really rich. The other thing I really like about his statement there is the honesty. What do you think about the resurrection? Well, I think it would take me about 3 years even to formulate an answer. Well, I was put in mind right away of St. Paul, who has an experience of the risen Jesus. But what does he do? He doesn't immediately begin preaching. Paul spends 3 years, we hear, in Arabia. And we get no further specification, by the way. Arabia, it was kind of a way of saying, I went out west. It's like where did he go? And what did he do? And for 3 years? That's a long time. Well, I think what he was doing was trying to sort it all out, trying to make sense of what in the world, The gospel we had last week, as I record these words, we had the transfiguration story, and Jesus says, don't speak of these things until after I've risen from the dead. And then that beautiful understatement, they said, and they came down the mountain and they asked themselves, what does resurrection from the dead mean? Well, it took Paul 3 years, having experienced the risen Jesus, to figure that out. So I say, fair shakes to Jordan Peterson if it takes him 3 years to come to grips with a question like that. So I like that. I think he's showing a lot of humility and honesty in the face of that question. He's not claiming to be an Orthodox Christian, but I think he's certainly intrigued by the question.
From the moment I started following Jordan Peterson's work, I noted a connection between him and another popular college professor who was equally enchanted by myth and the archetypes they represent, namely C.S. Lewis, the great Oxford Don, who was sort of a quasi-agnostic. He befriended two Christians, J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. And there's this famous evening stroll they took down Addison's Walk there outside of Oxford, where the two Christians began to show Lewis how the story of Christ is a true myth. It's a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. I'd be curious to know what Jordan Peterson would think of that sort of presentation of Christianity, that all these things you love about myth find their fulfillment in Christianity.
Yeah, no, me too. I think it's a very provocative comparison, Brandon. And Lewis, once he became a Christian, began to use that language of the good dreams of the human race. Now, there's someone that knew, as you say, mythology very well, classical, Roman and Greek, but also the Norse mythology, and all of that. And yes, furthermore, in those great myths are found these archetypes that Peterson and Jung and Joseph Campbell and George Lucas and many others talk about. So fully appreciating all that, Lewis said, these are the good dreams of the race, meaning the way the human race is anticipating what will happen in the incarnation. They're a sort of evangelizing of the imagination, if you want, preparing the mind to receive the good news of the incarnation. The other thing, remember, well, Lewis's line, those that say the resurrection is a myth haven't read many myths. Mm-hmm. In other words, he noticed, along with Tolkien and others, the difference. It wasn't so much the similar. There are points of contact, I think, and similarity. But what are really interesting are the points of dissimilarity. And I think of this, Brandon, every single Sunday when we recite the Creed and we say, the Word became flesh, and then he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Well, see, myth makers don't talk that way. They don't worry about that. Who was the emperor when Hercules cleaned the Aegean stables? I mean, it's a stupid question. What do you mean? What year precisely did Apollo? No one asked that, because the myths are about, once upon a time or in a galaxy far, far away. They're about generic truths of being, right? But when you break in and you say he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, you're saying, no, this happened. This happened. And we can, Pontius Pilate, I remember him. Yeah, he was the Roman governor around the year 30. Yeah, sure. If I say I was in Oxnard the other day, and then I drove up the coast and I came to Santa Barbara, and there I met, and I name a particular person, I'm not trading in mythological speech at that point. I'm telling you about something that happened, right? Well, the New Testament has mythic elements. It does indeed. But much more than that. It's got these strange historicizing elements. And the church has stubbornly insisted upon that. Now, here's a next observation I'll make. Even as we affirm all that's good and right and true in the mythic approach, I'll quote your friend Lewis again. One of the marks of liberal theology is a tendency to see God as the deep sort of background music of life, right? There's this sacred principle that's out there, and through our mythology and philosophy and so on, we might attain to some union with this principle. Well, okay, there's something right in that, but biblical religion says, no, God is a person who acts in history and who has purposes, and the game is finally not how do I attain union, but rather the primacy of grace, that God breaks into my life, changes me, rearranges me, calls me to respond, yes, indeed, but the primacy belongs to God. who's an acting person in history. That's the dimension that's missing in a Gnosticizing reading. Now, there's my long introduction to revisit what I said a few minutes ago. The danger is in Jung and Campbell and Peterson and many others is a Gnosticizing reading of Christianity. And there's where we have to, set some limits.
Well, let's close our discussion about Jordan Peterson with two broad questions. I want to zoom out here and look at everything we've discussed in summary. Let me ask you this. What can Christian evangelists learn from Jordan Peterson?
Oh, I think a lot. I like his clarity. I like his confidence. I like his boldness. I like how he believes in these texts. You know what I'm saying? He doesn't have just an academic detachment from them and, I'm very skeptical and I've got a lot of questions. He gets why these texts are life transforming and he wants you to know about it. Man, I take that any day of the week and twice on Sunday for an evangelist. Do you believe in these texts that you're preaching? And do you think it's a matter of life and death that they know about it? So I think that's a great lesson that evangelizers can learn from him.
And then how about this one? I want to get a lot of thought on this from you, given your experience as a rector, as a bishop now. You are in charge of a lot of priests in your region. What can priests learn from Jordan Peterson?
A lot. I like the fact that, and this is empirically true, that he's a spiritual father to a lot of, especially young men. Years ago, there's a great priest in Phoenix, and he said to me when he was coming of age in the seminary, what they missed was having Yoda on their shoulders. And now people know at a certain age what I'm talking about. In the Star Wars movies, when Yoda, the spiritual master, gets on Luke Skywalker's shoulders and begins to tell him what to do, right? Giving commands. And Luke needed that guidance to make his way through the spiritual thing. Spiritual masters who are clear, who know what they're talking about, who give instructions. I think armies of young men have responded to Jordan Peterson because he talks to them like a man and he gives them some real spiritual instruction. When I was coming of age, the stress was very much on let's sit in a circle, let's talk about our inner feelings, let's share our vulnerabilities. Now, and again, I'm not totally bad-mouthing all that. Don't get me wrong. There's something to all that. But honestly, young men don't tend to respond to that sort of thing. They respond to Yoda on their shoulders. They respond to Jordan Peterson saying, throw your shoulders back and act like a man and face life. And here's some wisdom from the great tradition. Now go do it. And I think priests should start talking more like that, especially to young men. And I think they'll get a better response.
Well, thanks for listening to this long discussion about Jordan Peterson. Again, if you go to the Word on Fire Show website, wordonfireshow.com, you'll find a bunch of helpful links to Jordan Peterson's articles, to his books, and to his videos so you can learn a lot more. Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Today, we're hearing from Catherine in New York, who asks a question about money and worship. Here's Catherine's question.
My name is Catherine, and I live in New York. And my question is about a critique I often hear about the Catholic Church, pointing to the opulence of our churches and sacred objects, or the money spent on building places of worship. People ask, how can you, in good conscience, be part of a church that uses money this way, given the multitudes of people whose basic needs are not met?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. It's a classic one, and I'm not blaming those who raised it to you, Catherine, but the logic goes right back to Judas. So remember in the Bible when the woman comes in and she breaks open the bottle of perfume, this expensive ointment, and she lavishly pours it on the feet of Jesus and all that, and the odor of it, the aroma fills the room. And it's Judas who keeps the purse, to care for the poor, who complains. I mean, come on, all this could have been sold, the money given to the poor. And Jesus, of course, does not agree with Judas. Here's a quick answer to a subtle question. There's more to religion than caring for the poor, as important as caring for the poor is. That's one of the dimensions of Christianity. But there's more to it than that. There's also call it the ecstatic element, the element of worship, of giving glory to God. So Pope Benedict said the church does three things. It evangelizes, it worships God, and it cares for the poor. Those three things. So opulent churches, is that somehow like an attack on the poor? Or is it an attempt to give glory to God, to express our love for God extravagantly in a way that's even a little bit over the top? Could the money have been given to the poor? Sure, as it could have been given 2,000 years ago to the poor when Judas complained. But I am resistant to what I call a Kantian reductionism. I mean here Immanuel Kant that said religion all comes down to ethics. And I think that influences a lot of our thinking today. It all comes down to ethics. I would say, no. That's a very important part of Christianity, but not the whole of it. And see those great churches and works of art and so on as the extravagant expression of the ecstatic dimension of religion. So that's a quick answer to a complex question.
Bishop, I think few people would deny that when you walk into a church like St. Patrick's, which is where Catherine is asking this question from in New York, or St. Peter's in the Vatican, your heart is lifted up to this transcendent realm. It's easier to worship God, it seems to me, in those places. And so I've heard people say, if what we're advocating is to sell all the ornate things in St. Patrick's or St. Peter's and give the money to the poor, you're not just depriving, the ordinary worshipers there who are wealthy and have means. You're also depriving the poor of being able to go into St. Peter's or St. Patrick's.
Yes, and let me give you an example. I know we're running out of time, but one of my great heroes, Father Bob Lombardo in Chicago, who was a Franciscan friar of the Renewal, comes to Chicago. He asked Cardinal George, "Give me the worst parish, give me the worst neighborhood. I'll take it." And he gets this parish that was absolutely in the worst neighborhood, completely falling apart. And Bob has turned that into a center of care for the poor. Nobody, and in fact, I say to Catherine, trust me, no one that's raised that question to you is doing more for the poor than Father Bob Lombardo. Okay. But Father Bob Lombardo also said, I want to renovate this church. And he raised and spent a lot of money making that church a beautiful place for the poor to worship. And I think that's a wonderful combination because he is off the charts caring for the poor, off the charts. And he spent a lot of money renovating a beautiful church. That's the Catholic balance.
Well, thanks again for listening to this week's episode of the Word on Fire show. For a bunch more links on Jordan Peterson and a lot of the topics we discussed, be sure to visit wordonfireshow.com and click on this episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.